I started off by wedging 2 pounds of clay, and the wedging process for this, since it's all box clay, is pretty much just making sure that the clay is all the same consistency and I'm able to get it into more of a ball. From there, it's time to go ahead and wrap up your bowl in newspaper. Take your newspaper, crumple it up to soften it up so it's easier to manipulate. And then since I'm using the inside of the bowl, I want to make sure that the middle part of my big sheet of newspaper is in the inside. Take your time on this, make sure it's really pressed against the wall. It did take a little bit of finagling on my part. I did end up cutting some of the newspaper to make sure that it wasn't too big for me to work with. And then I did use masking tape on the outside to adhere it to the bowl. I take a piece of clay from the ball of clay that I just wedged, and I kind of form it in the shape of my hand because our hands make rounded objects. From there, I'm going to go ahead and roll out a coil. When you start to roll out coils, be really mindful of how your hand is feeling. You don't want it to be too stiff. If you have a rigid hand, it's going to make a flatter object. And then also making sure that your wrist is nice and loose and your hand is a little bit more on the loose side. When I roll from the back of my palm all the way to my fingertips. And when the clay gets big enough, then I'm going to go ahead and use both my hands, making sure my hands go in the same direction. You never want to have your hands in opposite directions because then you'll never make an actual coil. It's just going to twist and fall apart. You want to get your coils about 1/4 inch thick, not any thinner, because you will be smoothing out these coils, and once you smooth out the coils, the entire bowl is going to get thinner as well. So 1/4 inch thick, even maybe to a 1/2 inch thick is going to be good. Mine are a little on the thinner side, it's about 1/4 inch. From there, I started off by scratching the coil and then adding slip to it and then creating a swirl. However, as I continued making this bowl, I realized that scratching and slipping the coils to themselves isn't necessary since I'm going to be smoothing the entire bowl out anyways. There is parts throughout the bowl that I decided to add some slip just to be on the safe side, or maybe there are some divots or lower areas that I wanted to add some slip to make sure everything stays together. But you don't have to be as regimented when you are adding slip and scratching everything. Because you're going to be smoothing everything out. It's going to be attached. When you make a swirl, you're pretty much just bending the coil as you see here. If your clay is too dry, it is going to crack. So you want to make sure that your clay is definitely on the plastic side. So right now I made the mistake of keeping my extra ball of clay out in the air. Technically, you guys should have that wrapped up or at least covered in some plastic while you're working with another portion of clay. To start with the bottom, this is going to be the bottom or the base of my bowl. Just putting it in the middle on the bottom, best you can, I think is the best way to start off with. That's how I decided to go about it. I guess technically you could flatten out a piece of clay and then create a form and put it in there as well, so it's more like a slab. But since this is a coil bowl and I do plan on keeping the coils on the outside, I wanted to continue that process, and that's why I created a coil for the inside and the bottom. As I continue adding coils, it's important that the coils are stacked on top of each other, and as I'm attaching them, I'm also pressing the coil slightly on top of the coil that's underneath it to really make sure it's attached, and then also smoothing everything out. So here you're seeing that I'm creating an accordion type of coil. It's just folding the coil back and forth to create that accordion effect. Keep in mind that if your coil is too thick, it's going to be more difficult to bend the coil. But also keep in mind that if the clay is too dry, it's also going to crack. Throughout this process, I'm really thinking about what type of coils I've already created, and I want to create a unified type of form. So in this bowl, I'm going to be doing the accordion coils and also the swirl coils. Other coil options would be braiding, twisting, pebbles, which are like little balls of clay. But for this bowl, I wouldn't recommend it because they're so small, and they'll probably end up creating more like weaker areas of the bowl. So I'd probably stick to something a little bit more unified, like the swirls, braids, twists, or accordions. As you see me smoothing things out, keep in mind that your hands are your best tool. So I'm using the thumb and the pads of my clay to really smooth things out, to get rid of the seams on the inside. You can also use a rib that you guys will be given. So notice how that is a term you've heard before. You guys all have toothed ribs in your bags. This time you're going to be using a smooth rib. Smooth ribs are used to smooth out clay, to either get rid of seams, creases, or textures. So you'll have the option to also have one of those in your bags for this project. As I continued adding more coils in the bowl to build up the walls of the bowl, I noticed that there were some spaces that I couldn't really fill with a coil, so that's when I went and added a little ball of clay, scratched and slipped it onto the bowl, and then smoothed it in. It's just a way to kind of reinforce maybe some weaker areas or some weak joints in the bowl, while still continuing that technique of keeping the coils seen on the outside and smoothing the inside. Now, there's no guarantee that the coils on the outside are going to be very good looking, especially because I was using a bunch of slip in the beginning. So the least amount of slip possible when making the actual coils is really important, but just be really mindful of your craftsmanship, because the messier you are when making this bowl, especially if you want to see the coils on the outside, then the more cleanup it's going to be in the long run. So just be really mindful about how you're working, keeping your hands as clean as possible, the table surface clean, and making sure that the clay is not drying out. I've chosen to make the lip of my bowl uneven. I just think it's a little bit more organic looking. It's more to my style. So it's completely up to you guys what you want your top part, the lip, to be finished off as. But what I would recommend is, if you're choosing to use coils like the accordion coil that has a lot more spaces at the top, I would recommend at least putting one normal line of coil on top of it, just to make sure it's strong enough, because the lip of your bowl can also be a weak place since you're picking it up from there so often. So you want to make sure that you're creating a strong bowl made out of coils, which can be fragile if they're not put together properly. The next day, when you're done hand building your bowl, is the day you're going to go ahead and take it out of the mold. So it's not a very easy process. It did take a little bit of careful holding and making sure I'm not going to put pressure on the lip of the bowl. So what I found best is kind of tearing the newspaper away from the bowl and then kind of using the newspaper as leverage, but then eventually having to put my hand on the inside of the bowl and then flipping the bowl really carefully so that the clay bowl comes out of the mold. Your newspaper will be kind of stuck to your clay bowl, so you want to make sure to carefully peel that away. If you can't get to like little bitty pieces of newspaper, that's okay. I'd prefer if everything came off. But the reason why we use newspaper is it's okay if it gets fired in the kiln. Nothing super bad is going to happen. And then once we are handling our bowls, it's really important you're always using two hands and you're always picking it up from the bottom. We never want to pick up our bowls from the lips. Again, they're the most fragile part of the bowl, so be really mindful about how you're handling it. If your bowl breaks or cracks, we can't fix it. It is what it is. So just be really careful when you're handling your bowl, especially at the leather hard stage, which is where it's at right now. You're seeing that the outside has those coiling techniques, the inside is nice and smooth, and yes, it's at leather hard stage, which means it's now time to go ahead and apply underglaze to the inside of the bowl and then begin sgraffitoing. We want to keep our bowl at a leather hard state. So we want to make sure to wrap up our bowl in plastic every night. No newspaper or wood, boards, or nothing is getting to the clay to dry it out. And we want to continue that leather stage until you're done sgraffitoing.